Well, welcome all. Thank you, all of you, for packing it in here. This is great to see, and hope you've been edified thus far at the conference. My name is Kurt Jarris, and I have a speaking teaching ministry called Veracity Hill. I wear a number of different hats. I'm also the director of marketing for Corpus Christi, and I'm an affiliate faculty member at Colorado Christian University. So if this conference has, again, been edifying to you, check out that table. Sign up if you want to learn more about the program. We'd love to have you. If you want to study under me, I'm mainly in the grad program. I have taught a couple undergrad courses, but yeah, so great program there. Check out the table. All right, so you've come here to learn about how we can know the Bible is true. And we are living in an ever-increasing secular society, and relativism is domineering. So that's true for you, but not for me. And so these sort of relative norms. And we really want to know if the Bible, as a historical collection of books, corresponds with reality. If it really happened. Of course, if it really happened, that has implications for how we live our lives. And as we may see, I mean, eventually that's what it comes down to for some people and their philosophical assumptions. It's because they know they have to start acting a certain way in a Christian manner. They have to stop doing those things that they enjoy doing. So that's what it comes down to. All right, so like any good sermon, even though this is going to be longer than a traditional sermon, I've got 3 points, okay? How many of you can recognize this image? Do you know where it's from? I heard Loki, yes. If you can remember Loki and the main villain there, you can remember the 3 points here today. Transmission of the text, veracity of the documents, and the accounts of eyewitnesses. So let's start first with the transmission of the text. So remember this year, 1947. Before 1947, the oldest manuscript evidence of the Old Testament that we had were a Greek Septuagint fragment dating to the 2nd century BC, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the Nash Papyrus, which only dates to about 1000, AD 1000. But in 1947, this was a good year for biblical archaeology, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the Qumran community in Israel. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are about roughly 950 manuscripts that were discovered of the Hebrew Bible. Everything except for Esther. And it dates, here's why it's significant, it dates to as early as the 3rd century BC. So why is this important? Well, it became the earliest manuscript evidence that we have of the Old Testament, but also it provided us an early date for example, the book of Isaiah. Now, how many of you have heard of Isaiah 53 as a prophecy pertaining to Christian belief? Okay, a few of you. So Isaiah 53, that basically the Messiah would come and would be crucified, right? So a number of liberal theologians have said, oh boy, that sounds like Jesus. It must have been written after Jesus lived. Okay, well, yeah. So with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, they had to shift their views that Isaiah was written before Jesus lived. We now had hard evidence that this biblical prophecy was written before Jesus existed. Okay, so they had to shift their views. We're going to see that come up a little later as well. An additional discovery was made in 1979 of what is now the oldest surviving biblical text that we have, and it comes from the Katif Hanam amulet, or what's sometimes called the Silver Scrolls of the Aaronic benediction. So that's Numbers 6:24-25, and it dates to the mid-7th or 6th century BC, again making them the oldest known biblical text that we have. All right? Now the Old Testament, for some guys, especially some big nerds, is exciting, thrilling. For others, it's kind of dull, dry. You know, it's like Leviticus. You just have to wade. You got to wade through it, right? So I'm going to just do a magic show to start here. Just, you know, maybe spice things up. I'm going to become the most powerful magician you've met, at least today. I might be the only magician you met today. I'm going to cause some Bible verses to disappear. Okay? So raise your hand if you've brought a Bible. In here? Or if you have a digital Bible, yeah, the smartphone, good. Does anyone have a King James Version or a New King James Version on them? We do, yes. How many? How many? Okay. Oh, wow, a number of you have the KJV. Okay, so here, I need a volunteer to look up this verse. Matthew 17:21. Who wants it? Raise your hand if you want it. Matthew 7. Oh, we're down here in front. Matthew 17:21. It could be KJV or NKJV. I'm a little specific as a magician. And I'm going to undo my sleeves here so you can see I've got nothing here, okay? Matthew 17:21 is the verse. Go ahead, out loud.
Howbeit this kind goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting.
Okay, some words of Jesus. Very common, easy verse to select. I'm going to recite a Latin incantation here. And if anybody guesses this incantation, they'll get brownie points with me. Credo in unum Deum, patrum omnipotentatem, factorum cali et terra, visibilium, omnium, et invisibilium.
Sounds like Harry Potter.
Disappearing verse. Does someone have an NIV or ESV on them? Could you look up Matthew 17:21? Da 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 da. It's not there. So we've made the verse disappear. Okay, let's take another. Luke 17:36 in the KJV or NKJV. Who's up next?
2 men shall be in the field, the one shall be taken and the other left.
Okay. More words of Jesus. All right. And anyone have an NIV or ESV? Oh, wait, before we do that. Credo in unum Deum, patrum omnipotentatem, factorum cali et terra, visibilium, omnium, et invisibilium. Okay, over there.
Not there.
Not there. Okay, the incantation worked. Let's take a third and final verse to disappear. Here, 1 John 5:7. It could be 8a. There's a little bit of 8 that's left over. KJV or NKJV. Anyone want to give that a read?
For there are three that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. And there are three that bear witness on earth, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these three agree as one.
Okay. One last time. Credo in unum Deum, patrum omnipotentatem, factorum cali et terrae, visibilium, omnium, et invisibilium. It's gone. Out of your Bibles, if you have an ESV, NIV, or a few others. Could someone from the NIV give it a try here?
Yeah.
There we go. It's not there. That's right. It skips verses.
But why?
But why, you may ask? Okay, well, so a good magician...
Not found in any.
Don't be revealing secrets. Only the magician can reveal the secrets. Okay, here we go. Magic's greatest secrets revealed. I may have been the greatest magician you've met today, but I will reveal the secret. So, why aren't those verses there? The reason why these verses are missing is because they do not appear in the earliest manuscripts. Okay, so when we're thinking about transmission, those verses were later added, scholars have come to believe. So, scholars have ways of categorizing the manuscripts that we discover. And they're frequently broken down into 4, sometimes 3 different families. We could really go to school if you wanted me to write these out, but I'll say them first. The first family is the Alexandrian family. And the Alexandrian family is the oldest set of manuscripts. The second family is the Western text type, which has the Old Latin and a Syriac version of the scriptures. The third is the Caesarean, the Caesarean. Caesarean is for women. The Caesarean, and a minority group of scholars think it belongs in the Western family there. That's why sometimes there's debate over 4 or 3. And lastly, the Byzantine family. Okay, and the Byzantine family of manuscripts is what the New King James Version and the New King James and a few others base their English editions off of. Okay, it wouldn't be appropriate to refer to it as an English translation. They are all English translations. But the reason why there are different editions is because the competing philosophies over how to best translate the scriptures. And these editorial groups use these families So where it doesn't include a verse or there's an editorial note, as we heard, so sometimes that's the case. For example, the woman caught in adultery in John's Gospel. Believe it or not, even though it sounds like something Jesus would do, it's not in the earliest manuscripts. So frequently there's a little note saying it doesn't appear there. Same thing with the last half of the last chapter of Mark. The same concept there. So that's why in some Bibles you're going to see verses missing. So let's get back here to the New Testament, looking at examples of the transmission of the text. I want to start with the New Testament regarding copies. There are roughly about 4,000 known manuscripts of the Bible, or parts of the Bible, made between the 2nd and 15th centuries. In particular, there are 3 codices that John Warwick Montgomery considers to be the greatest literary treasures to Christendom. Okay? And they are these 3: Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Alexandrinus. And if you think that this is the stuff that only scholars get to see, I've got news for you. If you want to go to London, England, you can go see with your own eyes Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Alexandrinus at the British Library. There's the British Museum, which has a lot of great, cool, fun artifacts. But if you want to see those, you go to the British Library. There are also numerous fragments of papyri. We're going to look at a few of those. So these are like complete manuscripts. You'll notice a later date, 4th century, 5th century, so 300s and 400s. But we have fragments even earlier. So the John Rylands Papyrus, okay, this is the oldest known New Testament manuscript. And it preserves John 18, 31 to 33, and on the back side, verses 37 to 38. So the John Rylands Papyrus, P52. So P stands for papyrus, okay? This is the way of organizing manuscripts, and they're given numbers. The John Rylands Papyrus is about the size of my hotel card, key card. Okay? So front and back. And it dates, here's where the theologically liberal scholars had to shift their views again. John's Gospel, they argued, came in the late 2nd and 3rd century. Okay? So, of course, if we think that John was an eyewitness, well, wait a second, if this is dated to late 2nd and 3rd century, it couldn't have been an eyewitness. Well, with the discovery of the John Rylands Papyrus, it dates to as late as, and no later than, 130 AD. It could be earlier. So this is the earliest biblical manuscript that we have. You can go see it at the University of Manchester. Again, that's the earliest we have. And it's forced the theologically liberal scholars to change their views now on the dating of the 4th Gospel. Some would say early 2nd century now. Some say 1st century. And 1st century is, of course, in alignment with what evangelical Christians have believed for a very long time. We have another collection of papyri. Closing up here, this is the last section on the New Testament. The Chester Beatty Papyri, 11 papyri announced in 1931, dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So this is not complete manuscripts, but it's earlier than those other codices. And the Bodmer Papyri collection, 22 papyri discovered in 1952, and is dated to around circa 200 AD. This is enough. Those documents alone are enough to compile all of Luke, John, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Hebrews. And portions of the rest of them. Okay, so you can get really darn close to a complete New Testament from those fragments alone, dating to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Okay, that chart's going to be a little hard to see, but when we compare the biblical manuscript tradition with non-Christian material, Plato, Homer, Thucydides, Julius Caesar, Tacitus, we can see that the biblical literature far and away is superior in all regards. It's a shorter gap in time from the time it was written to the earliest manuscripts we have. Okay, for others it could be, as you can see from the chart, hundreds of years. And yet historians have no problem with thinking that what we have today was what they wrote back then. So the gap is a lot shorter for Christian literature. But what I really want you to note here are the number of manuscripts. And here's why I want you to note this. For some ancient writers, we have a mere tens maybe in the hundreds of copies of manuscripts for something. With the New Testament, we have more than 5,000 copies of the New Testament. And that's important because if you wanted to see if there were any errors, the more manuscripts you have, the higher level of confidence, like exponentially, you could become confident that that's what they wrote back then. Because you'd be able to see how frequently an error creeps in and how it may have just been a one-time thing or if the error persisted. So you can analyze more. It's more data, right? And with more data, we can gain more confidence. So the fact that we have so many more copies than anything else from antiquity is very strong evidence. So even though many people want to place the Christian documents on a higher standard or a double standard, if you will, we can still meet that standard. So here's the bottom line on transmission. It must have been the incantation. By the way, any guesses on what that Latin phrase was?
Something to do with disappear the facts?
Not quite,
Not quite.
I believe in God Almighty, maker of heaven and earth.
but you got it.
What was visible has now become invisible.
Close, yeah. So it's not the Apostles' Creed, it's the start of the Nicene Creed. Of all things made visible and invisible. So I selected that because I would get it, visible, invisible. Yeah. So it's the start of the Nicene Creed, okay? One of our very beloved Christian creeds. All right, the bottom line on transmission, before moving to our other points, is that although textual variants, which is a change from one manuscript to another, are important to talk about, it's inaccurate to suggest that they would cause a reasonable doubt upon whether we could be certain about what the New Testament said. And even Bart Ehrman, who is a non-Christian New Testament scholar, he says this: in spite of these remarkable differences, scholars are convinced that we can reconstruct the original words of the New Testament with reasonable, though probably not 100% accuracy. All right, so even he says we can, with reliable certainty, know what the New Testament said. Now, he's frequently made out to be a boogeyman. If you've ever heard some other apologists talk about Bart Ehrman, they might paint him as this bad guy, a Darth Vader type. And fair enough, Ehrman's not a Christian. A number of the things he's said do not align with what we Christians believe. But on the transmission of the text here, he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus in 2005. It became a New York Times bestseller. And I think Christians have done a poor job on talking about that book. I think what Ehrman wrote in that book isn't all that controversial. And there are some evangelical scholars who think as much, but there are a lot of popular folks who kind of give Ehrman a bad name for that content. So I put out a 6-part video series. It's on a DVD at the Veracity Hill table. And this series caught Ehrman's attention. And he invited me to come. He posted all 6 videos at his website and invited me to come talk with atheists and non-believers at his site about the material. It was a good ministry opportunity, a witnessing opportunity to folks outside of our belief system. So yeah, more on that at my table if you want to come see me afterward. Okay, so it's one thing to say that the biblical text has been transmitted reliably through the centuries. But it doesn't mean it's true. It could all be false. It could be like, hey, let's make copies of Lord of the Rings, right? So you can have a reliable text of the Lord of the Rings written by Tolkien. It doesn't mean it's true. So it's another thing to look at the veracity of the documents. Veracity, habitual truthfulness. That when the documents are presenting themselves with the facts, that lends to the conclusion that they are, in fact, reliable. Okay, so the first point here. So we've got 3 points, 3 subpoints here under veracity. Luke the historian, Paul's letters, and embarrassing details. How many of you like Wheel of Fortune? All right, what's one of the categories there? People, places, and things. So this is people, places, and events. Okay, so what makes Luke a great historian are these 3 points. Luke was the travel companion of Paul, and he wrote his gospel and also the book of Acts. And in the first chapter of Luke, he specifically describes his intentions. He says, many have undertaken an attempt to write a narrative of the things that have transpired. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make an orderly account. And sometimes that word orderly could be translated as a chronological account. Usually it's the translation that you have in English editions is orderly, but that's in contrast to, for example, Matthew and Mark, which are perhaps organized thematically with an additional chronology, but not as structured. So Luke says up front what his intentions are. He's writing an orderly account. So the people he mentions: Pontius Pilate, Herod the Great, Sergio Paulus, Gallic, Felix, Caiaphas, Ananias, Gamaliel. Luke's uses of titles is astoundingly accurate for that first century. In Acts 13:7, Sergio Paulus is proconsul. In Acts 16:18, there's an archon. Acts 16:35, praetors and lictors, for what we would call a magistrate or an officer. And finally, in his gospel, he refers to Herod Antipas as the tetrarch. Imagine you lived in 300, 400 AD, and you wanted to write about that Jesus guy. You wouldn't know what these titles were. And you may not be certain that these titles refer to these specific individuals. What we have with Luke, when he refers to these historical figures, is 100% accuracy. There's not a single person for whom he has mistitled in his two books. And it's really led a number of scholars to realize just how strong of a historian Luke was. Places. Luke lists 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands without a single mistake. Events. I'll just give one example of many. The Jews were expelled from Rome. In Acts 18:2, we are told. Well, this is corroborated from an ancient historian named Suetonius in his work Lives of the 12 Caesars, who wrote, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome." Now, Suetonius published that work in 121, and Luke's Acts of the Apostles is likely to have been written, I would say, prior to 70. Okay, so we have an extra-biblical confirmation of the expulsion of the Jews from Rome. So time and again, Luke shows himself to be intimately familiar with people, places, and events. This is far and away different from, say, the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon, we haven't corroborated, generally speaking, folks have not been able to corroborate externally a single person, place, or event therein. So we're talking whole different ball games here, guys. It's not even like there's a mixture and it's on a spectrum. It's like black and white comparing those two documents. All right, let's get to Paul here. 2 points for Paul. So, Paul's letters have veracity in them. The letters that he wrote to different churches, frequently about the local troubles therein, included not only aspects of truthfulness, but the earliest Christian creeds. So aspects of truthfulness pertaining to the congregation, but early Christian creeds. That's important because that demonstrates that the creeds, the teachings of the early church, existed prior to Paul penning the letter. So even if you date a Pauline letter to mid to late 40s AD in that first century, to maybe in the 50s, the teaching that was passed along must have formed at an earlier date. And some scholars believe that 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, is the earliest Christian creed. And Paul is explicit. He says that this was passed on to him. He passes it on also to them. So we don't have time to get into it, but it's a real great creed, and you should all look at it when you have a chance. So, authentic content. Okay, if you were to write about a guy who's shepherding the early churches, if you had to make it up, there are things that you wouldn't put in there. So, for example, Galatians 6:11, Paul writes, "See with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand." That's just sort of a weird thing to say if you were making something up, right? That's something you wouldn't think of. Well, as it turns out, the more we've come to learn and discover about the first century, in the first century, it was extremely common to have a secretary draft the letter for you. Why? Well, because literacy rates weren't as high, and not just literacy, but writing. You had to be able to, maybe you could read, but you didn't know how to write. So you had to have someone write and draft it. So here Paul says he's writing these letters. Okay, so we see examples like that in Paul's letters, this authentic content. All right, let's move along to embarrassing details. All right, if you had to make up a story about this Jesus guy, maybe he wasn't a miracle worker, maybe that was all just legendary development. Let's suppose that actually happened, and so you're just crafting this material. You would not include embarrassing details. Why? Because you want people to believe that, you know, this is a persuasive thing. Embarrassing details make you look bad. So we're going to look at a few of those here. First, Jesus' family didn't believe him. They did not believe who he was. We're told this multiple times in the Gospels, more than those two instances. I just gave two there, but it appears more than those two verses. Also, John the Baptist, the guy who paves the way for the Messiah, sends his own messengers. Hey, are you the Messiah? Right? It's a little awkward, a little embarrassing. Women discovered the tomb. In the first century, women's testimony was thrown out in a court of law. It wasn't even respected. So if you had to create a story about discovering the empty tomb, you would have written that men discovered the empty tomb because they're the ones who are reputable, right? But instead, what's the matter of the fact? Well, women discovered the empty tomb. Craig Keener, a New Testament scholar, writes, "The witness of women at the tomb is very likely historical, precisely because it was so offensive to the larger culture, not the sort of testimony one would invent." And lastly, Peter, the leader of the early church, is called Satan. Youch. Boy, hey, come join our movement. Oh yeah, the one guy who was in charge called this other guy who's now in charge Satan. You want to join something like that? Not really. So it's awkward, right? It's embarrassing. And so that lends credence to the idea that this is historical material. Okay, TVA, Accounts of Eyewitnesses. First, I want to talk about external, non-biblical evidence. So this is evidence from the early church fathers on the authorship of the Gospels. We have the four Gospels. How do we know who wrote them? Looking outside of the Bible, we see that, especially a number of cases in Eusebius, but he's quoting from a church father, Papias, who was born in the second half of the first century and died in this first half of the second century. So he's a fairly early church father. He wrote, "Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able." So what makes this interesting is that we're told Matthew wrote in the Hebrew language. Well, the manuscript tradition, I got some bad news. We don't have any Hebrew manuscripts of Matthew. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, this has led some scholars to posit, to put forward a theory, which I think there's good reason to hold, that Matthew had like a first edition, okay, where he is passing on the teachings of Jesus. And this comes in the sayings, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, right? The sayings of Jesus, the Logion. And what happens later on is Matthew discovers, hey, I maybe need to write a little bit more here about what's happened. One of the priorities of the early church was passing on church teachings, specifically the teachings of Jesus to believers. And later on they realized maybe they needed to write down the works and miracles. So perhaps it's the case that with Matthew, his first edition was in Hebrew, and a second edition came later on in Greek. So also Irenaeus mentions Matthew. Regarding the second gospel, we have Papias also saying that Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. So Papias notes here that Mark's gospel is not in order. Contrast that with Luke's gospel, orderly account. Mark's gospel, again, thematically organized. We have Irenaeus again also saying the same thing as much regarding Mark, that he was basically a follower and interpreter of Peter. Luke, Irenaeus and Tertullian mentions Luke as the author of the third gospel, and John, same thing, Irenaeus mentions John. So is this all important? Well, it's important in that we have external evidence of the authorship of the Gospels, and also that there are no other names associated with the Gospels. So it's not as if this were disputed in the early church. Those 4 guys were the guys who wrote the Gospels. Okay. But it's not in the manuscripts. Well, that's fair. In Greek manuscripts, when Paul wrote a letter, he'd say, hey, it's Paul. I'm writing a letter to you guys. Grace and peace. In the Gospels, we don't have something like that. But there should be a point that's made with the fact that in the manuscripts that have the titles, we have the names. The Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to John. Now, some scholars aren't impressed with the titles. They may say, well, that was a later edition. Perhaps. Perhaps not. I mean, we don't have the autographa to compare it to. The autographa meaning the original, like an autograph. But it is, I think, still a small piece of valuable evidence. So let's just say that they are anonymous, okay? Does it really matter that they are anonymous? I don't think it does. And here's why. The value is in the content. You can look at the content alone and deduce an eyewitness or material from eyewitnesses. And that's what's important at the end of the day. Whether it's John who wrote the 4th Gospel or Thomas who wrote the 4th Gospel, it doesn't matter. But what matters is the content being valuable. Are they good sources? So yes, because they are eyewitnesses or 1 degree separated from the eyewitnesses, that makes it valuable. That makes it good. Sometimes with ancient Greco-Roman authors, they had no eyewitnesses. And they had to go off of other things that they were told, secondhand. And yet we still take it, typically, not always, that what they say is accurate. So when we're looking at the Gospels, when we're looking at the internal biblical evidence, we're dealing with good sources. Okay. Now I want to spend some time talking about the argument from undesigned coincidences, or what I call a meta-internal biblical evidence. What are undesigned coincidences? Well, this is an argument first put out by William Paley. If you're familiar with the teleological or design argument for the existence of God, he's the guy who gave the story of the watch being discovered in a field, the watchmaker argument.
What was his name again?
William Paley. But even though he's the first guy to write about it, he's not the guy who became popular for undesigned coincidences. That would have been J.J. Blunt in the 19th century. And so he argued that we can corroborate the biblical documents. Specifically, he looked at a number of them, including the Old Testament, but specifically we'll be looking at the Gospels. And we can cross-check them. Sometimes an author will leave out details and a natural question will arise, which another gospel fills in, so they fit together almost like puzzle pieces. So let's look at a couple of examples of this. In Mark chapter 1 and Matthew chapter 4, we have the calling of the first disciples, right? A lot of us, when we're little kids, we remember this story, and I will make you fishers of men. Remember that story? So in Mark and Matthew's Gospels, we are told that the disciples were mending their nets. Mending their nets, okay? Well, that's what fishermen do, right? They've got to, do maintenance on their tools. But why were they mending their nets? Well, go to Luke 5. Okay, Luke the historian. Luke decides, hey, I'm going to investigate. I want to learn more about this calling of the disciples. So he goes and talks to people. Well, he learns that there was a miracle that happened. The disciples were complaining, hey, we didn't catch any fish. So Jesus said, well, why don't you put it out one more time? And what happens? They bring in a haul. And, according to Luke, it breaks the nets. It's a detail not found in Matthew or Mark. So it's not as if Luke were copying those stories, right? This is new information only in Luke, right? A miracle story. And so it helps corroborate what has happened here. Now, so I think this is a very good undesigned coincidence. There's really a spectrum. Some are going to be weak, some are going to be strong. And I have given a presentation on the synoptic problem, which is determining the chronology and relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because there's a lot of commonalities between the Gospels, those 3 Gospels. And it's believed, for example, imagine you're Luke, and you have this a gospel called Matthew and a gospel called Mark, and you're using those as written sources that he may have been reviewing. So he's going to copy some of the details and sayings of Jesus. So you do get some of that. To what extent is debated by scholars, but you do get some of that. So this undesigned coincidence only works because I think that Luke was written later, after Matthew and Mark. I guess if I had to say later on a timeline, it'd be over here. Okay? And if Luke were written early, which is not what scholarship holds generally, then it could be that Matthew and Mark just sort of edited that detail out. So that's why it would be weak, depends on your view of the synoptic problem. And so there are other examples of that. But here's what makes undesigned coincidences really nice, is because there are some undesigned coincidences, which I'll give an example momentarily, which run both ways. So the example I just gave of the mending of the nets runs one way. So you have Matthew and Mark's account, and then you have Luke, which gives this detail about the miracle and the breaking of the nets, so it corroborates why they were mending the nets. Okay? It's one way. You have some undesigned coincidences which work both ways, bidirectional. So let me give an example of that. So why does Jesus stand up at the moment to wash the disciples' feet in John 13:4? Well, it's because they had been bickering about who would be the greatest in the kingdom, found in Luke 22:24. So when you compare the narratives, they're bickering, and then in John you read that he stands up. And so you can see here that there is fighting going on in the room, and so that's why he stands up. So it runs both ways. So that's a neat one, a bidirectional. So I've established, I've got a blog post at my website. I've established a set of criteria for what makes a good undesigned coincidence. In the scholarship from J.J. Blunt to Lydia McGrew has written a book called Hidden in Plain View. They just give examples, but they sort of don't come up with a methodology for what makes one a good UC. And I've done some discussion, debating, commenting online about this because I think a methodology is needed. And I think it needs more developing, but here are 4 principles. One, that the undesigned coincidence, or the alleged or possible undesigned coincidence, has unique material. So it's unique in its gospel compared to the others. That they're written in different contexts. So like the bidirectional one is the same context, same narrative. But if you have a comment in a totally different context, that lends credence. It might be like a throwaway comment that was made. Number 3, there's a natural question that arises. For example, why were they mending the nets? That's sort of a natural question. Some of the alleged UCs that have been put out there by some of my fellow apologists, the question's forced. And so it's almost like it's a little ad hoc. It's just contrived. So that's not as strong. I'd say that's a weaker example if it qualifies at all. And then 4th, that it's bidirectional versus unidirectional. So unidirectionals are good, but bidirectional UCs are great. So, as I've said, I think this is a good argument. It's sort of this meta-internal biblical evidence for them being accounts of eyewitnesses. It's not as strong, I think, as some big proponents of it make it out to be. But it's still good nonetheless. All right, let's review, and then we'll get into Q&A. So, how can we know the Bible is true? The transmission of the text has been faithfully preserved over the centuries. The veracity of the documents speaks of real people in real places doing real things. And the accounts of the eyewitnesses present testimonial evidence of people who saw and lived alongside Jesus and his earliest followers. Okay, questions and possible answers.